Spelled wrong. Okay. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Also, welcome to our online audience. In our series of prayers, we discussed the first prayer a Jew recites in the morning, called Moda Ani, in which he offers gratitude to God for having restored his soul. It was also noted that the Moda Ani prayer is recited before we wash our hands. And that means that even though our hands are not considered to be ritually clean, which doesn't allow us to mention God's name, we nevertheless could still say the Moda Ani prayer because it doesn't explicitly mention God's name. And we explained that the deeper on the meaning of that is that there's a certain core of our soul that is not susceptible to impurity. That no matter how one could contaminate himself or herself by doing things that are ungodly, the core always remains pure. And that core is represented by the Moda Ani, that a Jew says when he wakes up in the morning, acknowledging that God has given him the gift of life, without even mentioning God's name explicitly. We just say the eternal and living King. But a Jew doesn't just live by his core. We're not just going to be content with the fact that deep down there is something pure and holy about us. Jewish life begins with that premise that deep down our default position is godly and holy and good, but the default position is not enough. It has to manifest itself on every other level of our consciousness. It's not enough that subconsciously we're good. It has to be conscious. It has to permeate. It has to affect every aspect of our being. So the next stage, after we've said the Moda Ani and we've given expression to that core, that part of us that feels this gratitude to God that we're alive and that is not capable of becoming contaminated, we then set out to make ourselves better people and better Jews by purifying ourselves. And that's why we wash our hands in the morning. So if we follow the schedule, the way it's set forth in the Code of Jewish Law, the first thing we do in the morning, of course after waking up, is saying the Moda Ani. The next thing is washing our hands. And the way we wash our hands is to take a cup, fill it with water, and pour the water over our right hand, and then pour it over our left hand, again the right hand, again the left hand, again the right hand, again the left hand, and it's not a broken record here. We do this 3 times each hand, a total of 6 washings, but it's done by alternating. First the right, then the left, right, left, for reasons that I'll explain later. Actually, the part of our hand that we have to wash, ideally it should be the whole hand, but you can wash up until your knuckles. That's really the tips of your fingers are really what have to be washed. And I'll explain that as well as we go on. There are 3 reasons given for washing our hands in the morning. And we're not talking about hygienic washings of hands. Obviously, a person has to be clean, physically clean. Judaism is not just about spiritual purity, it's about physical cleanliness as well. However, the washing of the hands that we're talking about is above and beyond the physical cleanliness. Even if a person took a shower, they still have to wash their hands. In fact, whenever we take a shower and we're as clean as can be, we then have to wash our hands after the shower. But we won't go into that right now. We're talking about in the morning. So we wash our hands, and as we wash our hands, after washing the hands, we're supposed to recite a blessing. And that's going to be the subject of our discussion today. But there are really three reasons why we wash our hands. One reason is because we're going to be praying to God. We're going to be saying God's name. We're going to be focusing on the spiritual. Jewish law does not allow you to say God's name if your hands have come in contact with a part of the body that is usually covered. So even if you scratch your back and you put your hands under your shirt, you have to wash your hands, or at least rub your hands against something. It's disrespectful to have perspiring fingers in the process of saying God's name. That's a simple, very down-to-earth reason. A second reason given for washing your hands in the morning is that when we wake up in the morning, we're a new person. We're renewed. It's like a new life. So we're ready to start serving God anew. It's like we're just initiated into the service. Well, how do you show that you're preparing yourself for the service? Washing of the hands is a form of sanctification, a way of showing that we are now dedicating ourselves to the service of God. A third reason, and this is the reason that is most relevant in this particular discussion, is that when we sleep brings on a state of impurity. And I'll discuss it later. Does that mean that sleep is a bad thing? Some of my best friends do that every now and then. So it couldn't be that terrible. Yes, some people are looking forward to it. But we'll talk about that later, what it means that when you sleep, you're impure. But there's a certain spirit of impurity that rests on your entire body when you're asleep. As soon as you wake up in the morning and you're brought back to life, your soul begins to manifest itself, the impurity leaves you entirely, almost entirely. There's still some residue left on your fingertips. The impurity there doesn't go away. And by washing your hands, by alternating the washing, as I mentioned before, right, left, right, left, right, left, the impurity goes away. So this is going to be a little bit of a mystery, which I'll explain later on as we go through the blessing. We actually wash twice in the morning. As soon as we get up and we say the Moda Ani, we wash our hands. Then we go to the bathroom, take care of our bodily needs. And then after we come out, we wash our hands a second time. At that second time, we recite the blessing that we're going to be discussing and commenting on tonight. But before we go into the blessing, I think it's important to emphasize the role of water in Judaism. Judaism is very much a religion that revolves around water. It seems to be obsessed with water. We wash our hands when we wake up in the morning. Every time we go to the bathroom after coming out, we wash our hands, not just for cleanliness reasons. That's besides the point. Before we eat bread, we wash our hands. Before we start say our morning or afternoon or evening prayers, we wash our hands. When we go to the mikveh, we immerse ourselves in the body of water. We take a shower. Afterwards, we wash our hands. You go to the cemetery, even if you didn't touch the dead body, you wash your hands when you leave the cemetery. And going to the mikveh is, of course, a total immersion in the body of water. But there seems to be a major emphasis on water. So much so that it was a theory that was put forth by many people that the reason why it was reported that there were fewer Jews dying during the bubonic plague, and Jews were accused of poisoning the wells and were subjected to massacres because of that. But the reason why Jews had a lower incidence of infection was because they were so hygienically conscious. They would be washing their hands all the time. So before eating food, they would wash their hands after going to the bathroom. So if there was anything that could have caused them to contract the infection, they washed it off. There are those who say that no, the Jews didn't have a lower incidence of bubonic plague. It was just an accusation, an anti-Semitic one. But that's not the point. The point is that the fact itself that people were giving that as a rationalization shows how ubiquitous and how pervasive the idea of water was in Judaism. Water is a symbol of blessing. The Baal Shem Tov used to say that when you see someone carrying water, you should tell them that the Baal Shem Tov said that if you see someone carrying water, it's a symbol of blessing. Water is blessing, and it's an expression of divine kindness. Of course, we can't live without water. When they're looking for life in Mars, what are they looking for? Water. That's the most important thing. That's the first thing they look for. What is this about water that we are so obsessed about? Water is the symbol of purity. Water is the symbol of Torah. Torah is likened to water. Water is the symbol of divine kindness and benevolence. There's an interesting midrash that when God created the world, if you read the beginning of Genesis, on day 2, he separated between the upper waters and the lower waters. The upper waters represent spiritual water, and lower waters represent physical water. And the lower waters complained to God. That's first proof that water is Jewish. It complained. And the earthly waters complain to God and says, Anan bi'inan lemeve kadamalka. We also want to be in the presence of the king. Why should we be relegated to the earth? The heavenly waters are privileged. They're together with God. We want to be with God. And God's response to them is, you will be used in every ritual. Every ritual will require the use of water. Every time we wash for bread, we're using water. Every time we wake up in the morning, we use water. In the course of marriage, the woman uses the mikveh, and so on and so forth. So you will be in my presence no less so than the heavenly waters. Now, before we wash our hands, we have to say a blessing. What is the meaning of that? If washing the hands is a ritual, it's a way of serving God, what's the reason for reciting a blessing? So I have to give a little bit of an introduction about blessings. In Hebrew, the word is bracha, singular, and brachos, or brachot, in plural. There are 3 types of blessings. One type of blessing is called the blessings of pleasure. Whenever we derive physical pleasure from things, not from everything, but from food in particular, we're supposed to thank God, recite a blessing before partaking of the food. And there are some blessings that we say even after we ate the food. Birkat HaMazon, the blessing, the grace after meals, that's a biblical obligation. But the rabbis enacted the recitation of a blessing before partaking of food. The Talmud says that if a person derives benefit from this world without blessing God, in a way it's like stealing because the food belongs to God. You're taking God's food. Show gratitude, show appreciation, acknowledge that the food comes from God. So those are called blessings that we recite before deriving benefit, and it applies specifically to food. Then we have blessings of thanksgiving in general. When we see natural phenomena, there are blessings. When we hear lightning, we hear thunder, and we see the lightning, we recite blessings. You see a rainbow, there's a blessing. You see the sea, the ocean, sporadically, you make a blessing. Whenever we see natural phenomena, there are blessings to acknowledge that natural phenomena are God's creation. They're not just natural, not just Mother Nature, but they're divine. And the third kind of blessing, the one that is relevant here, is called the blessing for a mitzvah. Before we do a mitzvah, a divine act, a commandment, we recite a blessing in a way thanking God for the opportunity to do a mitzvah, for the opportunity to serve Him. Some people look at a mitzvah as a burden. Okay, I have no choice. God wants me to do it. My parents want me to do it. My rabbi tells me I have to do it. I'll do it. But Judaism doesn't look at a mitzvah that way. It doesn't look at it as a burden. It looks at it as a privilege, as an opportunity, as a gift. And the Rabbi would, I believe this is the Rebbe's analogy in a letter, that if two people are carrying rocks up a hill, up a steep hill, and one of them was, and they were both told that they missed a few rocks along the incline of the hill, one of them will be very upset that he has to go back to pick up those rocks because his whole wheelbarrow was filled with heavy rocks, and the other one will be grateful that he was told that he missed a rock on the hill. What's the difference between these two people? They're both collecting rocks, because the second one, who's eager to go back, is collecting diamonds. The burden is the same, the weight is the same, the hardship is the same, but when you know you're collecting diamonds, you appreciate every opportunity to pick up another diamond. That's how we're supposed to look at a mitzvah. How do you show that appreciation for the mitzvah? By thanking God. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with His commandments and commanded us to do X, Y, Z, whatever the mitzvah may be. And washing our hands in the morning is one of those mitzvahs that require of us to praise God and acknowledge that this is God's commandment. Now, where in the Torah does it command us to wash our hands in the morning? You can go from the beginning of Genesis to the end of the Torah. You will not find a verse that says, "Thou shalt wash thy hands in the morning." Neither in English or in Hebrew. You will not find it. It's a rabbinical commandment. It's rabbinical, and there are many rabbinical commandments, and the rabbis said that we should recite this blessing. So the question is, the blessing says that God commanded us to do these commandments. But if these are rabbinical commandments, how could we say that God commanded us to do them? So Maimonides answers the question very simply. In the Torah, we are commanded to follow the teachings of the rabbis. In the book of Deuteronomy, we're told that if you have any questions, you should go to the judges of your time. Whatever they tell you, you should follow. Do not stray from what they tell you, right or left. So in fact, and this is really stated in the Talmud, when the Talmud speaks about like the blessing before lighting Hanukkah candles. Now, Hanukkah candles are clearly a rabbinic requirement, a rabbinic mitzvah. But we do say the blessing because the Torah commands us, God in the Torah commands us to listen to the rabbi. So we are in effect listening to God's command when we fulfill a rabbinical commandment as well. So now we know that before we wash our hands, we're fulfilling a mitzvah, we recite this blessing. The only thing that I still want to explain, although this is not the place to go into it in depth, is that not every mitzvah requires the recitation of a blessing beforehand. For example, if you give tzedakah, you give charity, you lend money to someone in need, there is no blessing to recite before doing that. None of the mitzvahs that involve helping one another require a recitation of a blessing. These are only mitzvahs that pertain to our relationship with God. And there are different reasons given. I'll just share one very down-to-earth practical reason that I heard the Rabbi give. And that is that when someone comes to you who is in need and you have a mitzvah to help that person, he's hungry, you have to give him a sandwich. If you're going to get psyched up about saying a blessing, the poor guy is starving, but you're busy saying your blessing because you want to be inspired. When you're dealing with the needs of others, forget about your inspiration. You can be inspired after the fact. Don't delay. Do it as soon as possible. Actually, there's a commandment in the Torah that says we're not allowed to delay paying our debts, not our debts, but our vows. And the Talmud specifically relates that to tzedakah, to charity, that if you have an opportunity to give, you're not allowed to delay giving it because the recipient can't wait as long as you can. And that's why we don't have any burdens placed upon us, such as a blessing, before we do those mitzvahs. But be that as it may, when we wash our hands in the morning, we do recite a blessing. And what is the blessing? Blessed are you, God our God, King of the universe. That's the beginning of every blessing. A blessing for a mitzvah goes on, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us. That's the formula for every mitzvah. And here, fill in the blank, concerning the washing of the hands. Right. So the last part, concerning the washing of the hands, is the specific nature of this mitzvah, and therefore you have to acknowledge what the mitzvah is that you're going to be doing. So before we go into the washing of the hands part of it, which is the main part that we have to clarify, we really have to understand the text of every blessing. The first question that arises is that it sounds a little bizarre that we are blessing God. Most people, when they use the term blessing, you come to a great rabbi, a holy person, you say, I want you to bless me. Well, the man is a holy person, so you're asking him to bless you. He's above and you're below, and he's bestowing his blessing on you. Does it make sense that we're blessing God as if God needs our blessing? We're putting our hands on his head and saying, may you be blessed? That doesn't make any sense. So the idea of blessing God has several different interpretations. We're not blessing God. We are saying that he is blessed. Not that we're blessing him. We're acknowledging that he is the source of blessing. In Hebrew, the word for blessing is baruch. Medieval commentators point out that the word baruch is very similar to the word for a pool, a reservoir, brecha. That God is the reservoir of all that is good. So when we say, blessed are you, we're saying, God, you are the source of all blessing. Any blessing that comes to the world and to us individually is really coming from your pool and your reservoir of goodness. So that's the first understanding of it. But then the Hasidic masters, based on the teachings of Kabbalah, take it another step. And they say that by just acknowledging that God is the source of blessing, that's very nice that we're acknowledging that, and it's important that we acknowledge that. But that wouldn't seem to be doing anything other than showing that you are appreciative of God's benevolence. So it's like any other praise of God that we have in our prayers, but this is not just a prayer. This is a bracha, a blessing. So there's a second step over here. And again, it relates to Hebrew. Hebrew is the holy tongue, and one word can have several different meanings, and they're all interconnected and all intertwined. So bracha means blessing. It means reservoir, a pool. But the word bracha is also related to a Hebrew word which means to draw something down. For example, the knee in Hebrew is called berech. Why is a knee called berech? Because when you bend your knees, it lowers your stature. Or when Torah speaks about the camels being lowered, vayavrech es hagmalim, he lowered, made the camels kneel. Also, we find in the laws, agricultural laws, whenever you take a plant and you want to grow another plant, so they take I think it's called layering, they take the shoot and you turn it over and you plant it in the ground. That's called havracha, same root as the word bracha. You're drawing it down into another place. But this is really the most significant word in relation to a blessing, because when you say someone kneels, it's only a physical movement from a higher stature to a lower stature. But here you're actually drawing nourishment from one place and extending it to another place. It's more than just lowering something, it's bringing life from a higher place to a lower place. And that's what a bracha is. A bracha is not just acknowledging, yes, there's a pool, a reservoir of blessing up there, but we're also saying to God through the blessing, and we're actually affecting the movement of God's blessing from the source down into our world. Because it's not enough to say, or it's not enough to acknowledge, and that is the reality, that God is the source of blessing. How does the source of blessing come to us? Whether it's physical blessing, or whether it's a spiritual energy that we want to get through the mitzvah. When we do a mitzvah, we generate spiritual energy, but spiritual energy starts off on a higher plane, and we have to draw it down to our life, to our existence. So there are many obstructions along the way. So we have to channel that energy down into our consciousness, into our lives, that we try to accomplish through the mitzvah. So the bracha is the facilitator of that extension of divine energy from its source, from the pool, through the channels, into our lives, and from our lives into the rest of the world. So that's essentially what a blessing is. Now, the blessing starts off with the words, "Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe." We're saying four things. Blessed are you, then we say God, then we say our God, and then we say King of the universe. There's no superfluous word here. The blessings were composed by prophets. These are people for whom every word was measured, every word was divinely inspired. So there's no poetic license over here just to repeat words for the sake of making them sound more elegant. There are four different steps over here in the blessing. When we speak to God and we say you, we're talking directly to God. And that's talking directly to God's essence. That's the source. That's the ultimate source, God's essence. Then God's essence has to come down to us. It comes down through God. The name God here is the tetragrammaton, which is God's name that consists of four letters, a yud, a hey, then a vav, and another hey. And Tanya explains, based on Kabbalah, that these four letters are descriptive of a transitional process, how something comes from higher to lower. And we find that in every process in the world. For example, if a teacher wants to teach some very abstract, arcane subject to a student on a very basic level, the teacher has to first take his understanding of that subject, which is very deep and advanced, and has to constrict it, has to condense it into a little yud, which is a point, a geometric point. He cannot keep all of his advanced knowledge in his mind consciously and expect to transmit that to the student. So he has to first, what they call in Kabbalah, tzimtzum, he has to contract his knowledge and withdraw completely all of that which he has in his mind, because that's going to overwhelm the student. But then, if he withdraws all that knowledge from his mind and just has a seminal point, there's nothing to transmit. So then he has to develop a structure that he's going to use in teaching the student. But this structure is now on a much lower level. So he has to develop a whole structure, a whole lecture. That is compared to the letter Hey. It's a letter that has dimensions, has a horizontal line, a vertical line. It represents a full dimension of knowledge. But then he has to communicate that knowledge. That's what the letter Vav. Vav is a line. It comes from a vertical line. He has to bring it down. He has to explain it to the student. He has to have sometimes you could be a brilliant scholar, but you don't have the gift of articulation to be able to articulate it to the student. And then the final hay is where the idea enters the mind and consciousness and frame of reference of the student. So every process, so of course, God's essence, for it to come to us, has to go through a process. God has to first constrict himself, then he has to create a system of divine energy that relates to our world, and then he has to bring it down to our level, and then it has to become internalized within us. That's the general process, and there's much more to it than that, but that is, for our purposes, that will suffice. So that's the second thing. We say, blessed are you, God's essence, that transcends letters and systems. Then we go through God's 4 letters, which is the process through which God allows the energy to come into our soul, into our consciousness. Then we say, our God. Now, the Hebrew word for God here is a different one. It's Elokeinu, related to the word Elokim, which is the God of nature. In this context, it means that transcendent aspect of God, because the God's name is transcendent, becomes internalized within us and becomes our strength, our nature. It is now becomes part of us. But that's not the end. Through us, it then goes to King of the universe. The energy is then projected outward to the rest of the world. So every time we do a mitzvah, we say the blessing, we are connecting to God's essence and bringing that essence through God's transcendence into our internal system, and through our internal system to the rest of the world. That's the formula of every blessing. And then we say, who has sanctified us with his commandments. The Hebrew word for sanctified is kiddushanu. It's related to the Hebrew word kiddusha, holiness, kadosh. Now, what does the word holiness mean, or sanctification? Those are English words, and we use them often, but we have to understand what they really mean in terms of Jewish theology. The Hebrew word for holiness or sanctification, kiddusha, has 2 separate meanings. On one hand, it means separated, divorced, separated, removed. When something is on a higher level, that person is separated from everyone else. A hermit, you could say, is kadosh. He's separated from society. That doesn't make him better than anyone else just because he's separated. Doesn't mean that you have a positive agenda. Someone could say, I hate this world. It's a horrible world. I'm going to separate myself. Okay, you're separated from it, but doesn't mean that you are necessarily in a better place than that which you're separating yourself from. Maybe you're less vulnerable, but you still haven't really acquired a positive identity. Then the word holiness also means you are in a better place. You are in a divine environment. It's like marriage, because in Hebrew the word for marriage is kiddushin, is sanctification. When a person gets married, 2 things happen. One is you're separated from everyone else. Before you get married, you're eligible, well, theoretically, there are 7 billion people, you're eligible to 3.5 billion. Well, I'm not going to go into any other. Right. You have a lot of eligible people. Once you go through that ceremony, you're cut off from everyone. That's the ultimate discriminatory act, is getting married. That you are married to one person and to the exclusion of everyone else. But that's not a marriage. If it's just that you're excluding everyone else, the marriage has to have a positive side, that you are connected to that one person. So you can be legally married, but you're not really enjoying a true kiddushin, because you're only separated from everyone else, but you're not attached emotionally and spiritually to the person that you're married to. So marriage is 2 things. You're separating yourself and you're attaching yourself. And that's what a mitzvah does. A mitzvah separates you from the rest of existence. For that moment that you're doing the mitzvah, you're no longer part of planet Earth or of the universe, the physical universe. You divorce yourself from it momentarily, but you're also attached to something that is divine, that is beyond the universe. You escape the universe. The universe is so you have to run away from it, but you have to be attached to something positive. That's what a mitzvah does. So a mitzvah, the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, is marriage. It's a marital act. We are married to God, separated from the rest of the world and the rest of our experiences that are mundane, that are ordinary, and we're connected to the source of everything, which is God. Okay, so now he commanded us concerning the washing of the hands. And it will be said at the very outset that why do we have to wash our hands? One of the reasons is because when we're asleep, we become impure. When we wake up in the morning, the purity returns to us, except at our fingertips. They remain impure. They have to wash them. Okay, this requires a little bit of clarification because it sounds a little strange that we're equating sleep with impurity. There are two different types of impurity. Where is God present? God is all over, of course, but where do we see a manifestation of God? In life. An absence of life means God is hiding. Death, why does it say in the Torah that if you touch a dead body, you become impure? It's a mitzvah to bury the dead. So why would you be punished that you're called impure by doing a mitzvah? The answer, or sleep for that matter. Why is it God created us that we have to sleep? No human being can go without sleep. So why does it make us impure? No, it doesn't make you bad. Impure does not mean bad. Impure means that there are places in the natural world in which God's presence is curtailed. And that's part of God's design of the universe. God wants there to be lapses in his presence to give us time to rest, to rejuvenate ourselves, to challenge us. And after that period is over, whether it's sleep, when you wake up in the morning, when it's death, God forbid, after the Shiva period, when the person goes through the mourning is not just a time of grief, the mourning, not just a time to psychologically get yourself to regain your health, emotional health, which it does, but it's more than that. It's the lull that is a necessary part of life. You can't go straight from one day to the next. You have to have a pause in the middle, and God creates that pause, and it manifests itself in many different ways. But the common denominator in all different forms of impurity is that there has been a curtailment of life. A woman, when she has her period, is considered to be impure. So some people have taken that, you see, look how they put down women. No, it's like sleep. It's a time when she loses potential life. And the loss of potential life means now it's the time to pause. Now there's a pause in your life to give you strength that when you regain your potential for life, you're on a stronger and higher level. That's one form of impurity that is not negative at all. It's part of life that God created. He wanted there should be times and places where his presence is not felt as strongly, because that creates this stronger energy. If you're used to God all the time, and there's no change, there's no pause, there's no lull, you'll never grow. It'll just become more and more routine and perfunctory. There's another type of impurity where God is curtailed when we do things that are contrary to God's will. When we commit a crime, that experience is a godless experience. It's an anti-God experience. We committed a crime. We went against his will. So we pushed him out of our consciousness. That's a negative type of impurity. But the mistake that people make is that the word that's used for impurity in Hebrew, tameh, can be used for either. But it doesn't have negative connotations. It just means a curtailment of life, of divine energy in a certain experience, in a certain person, in a certain time, in a certain place. It could be natural, God-given, and it could be induced by our own bad choices. One is positive, the other is negative. The other can also become positive. When a person does tshuva, when he repents, and his repentance is so intense and passionate because he feels terrible that he distanced himself from God, then the pause that he created by his sin becomes a positive force. But that's for another time. So when we sleep, we lose some of that divine energy in us. So God's presence is less pronounced. Sleep is said to be, the Talmud and the Zohar say, 1/60th of death. So there's a certain amount of curtailment of God's presence. And what we do in the morning when we wake up, life comes back, so we're back again. We're pure. Except there's one part of our body that remains curtailed, and we have to pour water over it. This has a symbolic meaning. Our hands are the limbs through which we interact with the outside. So hands are expressive of our emotions, of our character. The right hand, for example, the stronger hand, for the left-handed person, it's the left, but it's the stronger hand, is the hand with which we give things to others. It's an expression of our kindness. Our left hand, an arm, which is the weaker one, with which we don't give, is the hand of withholding. So the hand expresses our emotions. But very often, there are emotions that we have that are positive, but if you don't use the right understanding, if you just allow yourself to be governed by emotion, emotion is very subjective. It can lead to negative things. Example given, a parent, a teacher, a rabbi, or any person for that matter, has to, intervene when you see someone doing something wrong. You're supposed to teach, you're supposed to guide and instruct. But very often, in the process of teaching, we find this to be very true, unfortunately, in schools and with parents and with others, that they use that as an opportunity to harm the other person, to be too tough on the other person. And they're not really in the mode of helping the person, they're really becoming very abrasive and hurtful to that person. And the symbol of that are your nails. Now, you could be talking to a person and then you use your nails to jab them, to stab them. That's an expression that is used to describe a negative attitude that you use. It may have started off because your role is to teach, your role is to guide, your role is to mentor, your role is to set people straight. But then it becomes an ego trip, and you begin to use your role as a teacher to harm the other person, whether it's through physical harm, whether it's emotional harm. That's where your emotions could start off being very positive. I'm dedicated to teaching and to helping the person, but then it becomes a negative force. Another example that's given in Hasidic literature, a person could be very spiritually passionate. And when he says his prayers, they get all excited and very passionate. Then they finish their prayers, and then they go to eat breakfast, and they become just as passionate about the scrambled eggs. once you have an emotion, the emotions don't know how to differentiate between one thing and another. Person, let's say, to use the another emotion, a person is a strict disciplinarian. That's a positive thing, to be rigid and strict in terms of one's morals. But sometimes a person could take that and use it improperly by being very tight and very harsh, and not a very positive type of person. It can be a very mean-spirited individual. But it starts off by a person who has a discipline, because emotions, by their very nature, are not true. They're subjective. It's how I feel about things, not how things really are. Intellect, in contrast, is objective. Intellect shows us what is real and what is not real, what is proper and what is improper. So if you have your emotions going without any direction from the intellect, positive emotions inevitably will end up being like nails. Just like the nails in the body, you know, you don't have to have much effort for the nails to get dirty. They get dirty before any other part of the person gets dirty. Dirt accumulates. They're sharp. They could stab you and jab at you. Well, emotions could be not controlled by intellect. Positive emotions could deteriorate into negative ones. That's why when we wake up in the morning and we're raw, even though we're no longer impure because our soul came back, we're alive, but we have to be very careful with the extremities of our hands, of our emotions, and we pour water over them. Water is the symbol of knowledge, of intellect. That now we're erasing all the negative effects of our emotions. That our emotions are not just raw subjective emotion, not just feelings, but they are subjected to the barometer of truth. We know when it's a good emotion, we know when it's a bad emotion. And that's why we wash our hands. And when the word for washing, natila literally means taking the hands, but it also has the connotation of raising them up. You're raising them up. They're not just emotions. Even a baby has emotions, but a baby's emotions are not good emotions. If an adult has that, for a baby it's all right. That's what you expect. But for an adult to have baby emotions, to have tantrums, we obviously don't think that that's a mature thing. You need the water to get rid of those tantrums, get rid of those distortions of your emotions. There's an interesting thing that I believe it's in the Talmud, that a person who skimps on washing their hands leads to poverty. What does that mean? I mean, it doesn't say that if you don't do this mitzvah, you'll become poor. Why specifically this? And it's interesting that the words of the blessing, Al Nitilas Yadayim, the acronym, the initials of those three words is Ayin Nun Yud, that spells ani, poor. That if you don't wash your hands properly, you will become impoverished. So the Hasidic interpretation of that means, the Talmud says, there is no such thing as poverty except in knowledge. You could be penniless and you're not poor if you have your mind. Well, if you don't wash your hands, what does that mean? That means I'm happy the way I am with my feelings. I'll let my feelings govern my life. I don't need the water. I'll take a little, but not any more than I absolutely need. Well, you are subjecting yourself to impoverishment. You are spiritually impoverished because you're not giving yourself the opportunity to make your emotions, to elevate them and make them pure, and make them mature and holy. Why do we alternate? We wash the right and the left, the right and the left, the right and the left. So the source that is given is the Kabbalistic sources. But the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, one of his discourses, explains it very simply, very much down to earth. When you wake up in the morning, you're not very advanced at this stage. You're still very much just out of bed. You just woke up. You just experienced this curtailment of life. So you're very raw, vulnerable. Don't try to change everything all at once. You cannot do that. You do the right first. You take one of your emotions and you pour a little bit of water on it. You then go to the left, which symbolizes different kinds of emotions. Right and left are different kinds. You go back to the right. There are different ones on the right that you have to deal with, then back to the left. When you wake up in the morning, don't think you're going to transform yourself entirely. You'll try to do that, you'll end up not having the ability to transform anything. You take each emotion separately, pour a little water over it, you'll come back, you'll do more, but you keep on alternating back and forth. The end result will be that your emotions will be uplifted, they'll be clean, they'll be uplifted, and you're ready to take on the day. So that's the blessing that we say before we wash our hands. We also say this blessing when we wash our hands before partaking of bread. We wash our hands then, but then we don't do it by alternating. Because when we're ready to eat our meal, we're already a little bit more advanced and sophisticated. It's not waking up early in the morning. And we're ready to deal with the emotions in their entirety. We're not dealing with getting rid of negative, we're more focused on the positive. But when we wake up in the morning, we have to deal with the negative, not just with the positive. Even though I said before that we wash our hands twice in the morning, as soon as we wake up and say the Modani, we wash our hands, then we go to the bathroom, we wash it. And in some sources, it suggests that the first time it's more the reading of the negative, the second time is more of a focus on the positive. But in both cases, there is an emphasis on the negative as well. Okay, so next class we'll be dealing with another blessing that we recite in the morning, and anytime we take advantage and we use the facilities for our bodily needs, there's a special blessing for that, which is unique in I think in Judaism. But we'll discuss that, God willing, next class. Have a good night. And for those who are still listening, I wanted to say this in the beginning, but I'll say it now. This class I want to dedicate to the soldiers in Israel who are risking their lives to protect the Jewish people in Israel, fighting evil in the most literal sense of the word. And let this course of study be in their merit and protect them and protect all of Israel.